I'm so happy to welcome back to the stage of the New Haven Symphony the wonderful violinist Ty Murray, particularly in her new role as a New Havenite and a member of the violin faculty at the Yale School of Music. She's chosen for this appearance the Stravinsky Violin Concerto, one of the great violin concertos of the 20th century, and a piece that demonstrates Stravinsky's style that he adopted kind of through the middle of the 20th century. Having started life out as a kind of enfant terrible, writing 3 seminal ballets at the beginning of the 20th century, the Firebird, Petrushka, and the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky adapted his musical style in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to become what part of a movement that's generally described as neoclassical. In this case, it generally means more tonal kind of music, leaner, clearer textures, and a kind of throwback to an earlier era. The Violin Concerto is in 4 movements, all of them fairly short, and they have one unifying element, and that is the very first chord that you hear at the beginning of each movement. And there's a little bit of a story behind the chord. Stravinsky wrote it a 3-note chord for the violin, and between the first 2 notes there's a reasonably wide interval. Between the second and the first note there's a very, very wide interval. And he asked the soloist, Samuel Dushkin, for the first performance, as he was beginning to write the piece, is this chord possible? And Dushkin, without really trying it out, looked at the interval and said, this isn't going to work. He said, no, unfortunately not. And Stravinsky said, too bad. But as it turns out, this chord is possible on the violin, and you'll hear it at the beginning of each of the 4 movements. But the chord launches 4 very different kinds of movements, even though it's the same chord. The first one is a kind of a chugging toccata-like movement, so it's based on a kind of a motor rhythm. The second is a little bit more freewheeling and improvisatory in nature. The third movement is a slow-moving, almost meandering, Bach-like piece. And the last movement is entitled Capriccio, and it's filled with all sorts of hijinks and virtuosic tricks for the violin and for the orchestra, with whom there's a great deal of interaction. And the sting in the tail is the very end of this movement, which is a kind of a game of let's see if we can trip up the listener into finding out how many beats there are in the bar. Like some of Stravinsky's earlier music, it delights in confounding our expectations and putting an accent where we least expect it. So there's a great deal of wit and good humor to the concerto, and it's going to be an absolute pleasure, as I say, to welcome back Ty Murray to perform it with us.